I always thought my parents' obsession with rearranging my furniture was just narcissism until I found the illegal files stuffed inside my air vents. They were not visiting me, they were framing me. Instead of changing the locks, I quietly moved out and turned my empty penthouse into a trap. When they broke in at 2 in the morning expecting a safe house, they found the FBI waiting to hand them a 15-year sentence. My name is Rowan Vance, and at 30 years old, I had built a reputation as a meticulous independent art appraiser. I could spot a forgery in a 16th century fresco from across the room, but for years, I had been blind to the counterfeit nature of my own family. I lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, a property that should have been a symbol of my success. Instead, it was a golden cage. My name was on the deed, certainly, but it sat on the second line, right beneath the names of Harrison and Sylvia Vance. To the world, they were real estate tycoons and philanthropists. To me, they were the landlords of my existence. I returned home late one Tuesday after a grueling 3-day trip to Chicago. I was exhausted, craving nothing but silence and the familiar scent of my linen reed diffuser. However, the moment I unlocked the door, my stomach tightened. The air did not smell like linen. It reeked of Chanel No. 5 and aggressive entitlement. My mother had been here. Again. I walked into the living room and saw the violations immediately. My velvet armchair had been rotated 45 degrees to face the window. My stack of auction catalogs, which I had arranged by date, was now color-coded. It was a power move, a subtle, maddening reminder that nothing I possessed was truly mine. My phone buzzed in my hand before I could even set down my suitcase. It was Sylvia. "Mother," I answered, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor of rage in my hands. "You were in my apartment." "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Rowan." Her voice purred through the speaker, dripping with that toxic sweetness she reserved for charity galas. "We were just checking on the investment. That place is a mess. Darling, honestly, I don't know how you live like that. It's embarrassing. I changed the locks last month." "Mother," I said, gripping the phone tight enough to turn my knuckles white, "and we paid for the door. Remember, a spare key is just prudent parenting. Don't be ungrateful. We just want what is best for you." She hung up before I could argue. I stood there, feeling the walls closing in. Prudent parenting. I walked into my study, needing to check my valuables. I knelt by the wall, safe hidden behind a false panel. I always wiped the keypad clean before I left. Always. But now, there was a faint, greasy smudge on the 0. Someone had tried to get in. They had failed, but the attempt sent a cold shiver down my spine. Why would billionaires need to rob their daughter? The cold feeling in my chest reminded me of Aunt Beatrice. She was the black sheep of the Vance dynasty because she actually possessed a conscience. Before she passed away 2 years ago, she had grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for a dying woman. I could still hear her raspy voice echoing in the silent apartment. "Rowan, listen to me. They don't love you." She had wheezed, her eyes wide with a terrified urgency. "They only own you. Never forget that." I tried to shake off the memory and went into the bedroom. That was when I saw it. There was a loose floorboard near the radiator, a spot I knew about but never used because it was too close to the heating pipes. The rug covering it was slightly askew. I pulled the rug back. The wood was scratched. Someone had pried it up and hastily stomped it back down. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was not just about rearranging furniture or asserting dominance anymore. They were looking for space. I did not call the police. The police in this precinct played golf with my father on Sundays. Instead, I went to my professional equipment bag. I took out a high-resolution pinhead camera, usually reserved for inspecting the weave of canvas on suspected forgeries. I mounted it on the top shelf of my bookcase, hidden inside the spine of a hollowed-out encyclopedia. It pointed directly at the bedroom vent and the floorboard. I waited. 7 days later, I pulled the memory card and loaded it onto my laptop. I scrubbed through hours of empty footage until the timestamp read 2 in the morning on Tuesday. The door opened. My father, Harrison, walked in. He was not wearing his usual tailored Italian suit. He wore a black tracksuit and gloves. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the empty room. I watched in silence as he did not even look at my bed. He went straight for the ceiling vent. He pulled a chair over, stood on it, and unscrewed the grill. He was holding a thick black briefcase. He opened it and pulled out stacks of documents and a heavy-looking hard drive. He shoved them deep into the ductwork, pushing them back as far as his arm could reach. "Damn it! Fit, you stupid thing," he whispered on the recording. His voice strained and breathless. He sealed the vent, wiped the chair with a handkerchief, and left. I sat back, the blood draining from my face. I looked up at the vent above my head. They were not just invading my privacy. They were using my home as a dead drop. If the authorities ever came for them, they would find the evidence here, in my apartment, under my name. They were setting me up to take the fall for whatever dirty dealings were in those files. I was not their daughter. I was their scapegoat. I waited for 3 agonizing hours after watching the footage to ensure the coast was truly clear. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a potent cocktail of adrenaline and rage. I went to my restoration kit and pulled out a pair of white cotton gloves, the kind I used when handling Renaissance oil paintings. I would not leave a single fingerprint on my own destruction. I dragged the stepladder into the bedroom, unscrewed the vent, and retrieved the package. It was heavier than it looked. I sat at my dining table, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator, and laid out the contents of the black bag. The paper documents were financial ledgers, but they were unlike any I had seen in the public filings of the Vance Corporation. They were parallel books. On the left were legitimate donations to the Vance Global Relief Fund, and on the right were the actual destinations of those funds' shell companies in the Caymans and private accounts in Zurich. They were laundering millions through fake charity projects. But the hard drive was the smoking gun. I connected it to an air-gapped laptop I used for secure appraisals. I decrypted the files. My father used his own birthday as the password, typical of his arrogance, and found a folder simply titled Insurance R. My breath hitched. Inside was a detailed memorandum dated 6 months ago. It outlined a contingency plan in case of a federal raid. The strategy was simple: plant the incriminating hard drives in my apartment, claim I had embezzled the funds to support a lavish lifestyle, and testify that they were shocked by their daughter's betrayal. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. I was not just a daughter to them. I was a firewall. I was a human shield designed to take a bullet so they could keep their country club memberships. The tears I expected never came. Instead, a cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of any lingering affection. If they wanted me to be a criminal mastermind, I would certainly show them one. My mind raced back to Aunt Beatrice. On her deathbed, she had pressed a tarnished brass key into my palm. It belonged to a storage unit at a facility on the edge of town, a place my parents would never set foot in because it smelled of diesel and desperation. "Use it when the sky falls," she had whispered. I grabbed my coat and drove across the city. The storage unit was small and dusty. Inside, I found a metal box containing $50,000 in cash and a thick binder of legal documents. Beatrice had been collecting dirt on her brother for 20 years, but the most valuable asset was a business card stapled to the inside cover: Elias Thorne, attorney at law. I met Elias an hour later in a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. He was a sharp-featured man with eyes that looked like they had seen every sin mankind was capable of committing. He listened to my story without interrupting, his face unreadable until I showed him the Insurance R memo. "Your parents are monsters," Elias said, his voice low and raspy. "But they are powerful monsters. If you go to the police now, Harrison will have the evidence suppressed and you committed to a psychiatric ward before noon. We need to be smarter. I want them to pay. Elias, I want them to lose everything," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I can't let them do this to me." Elias leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Then we don't fight them. We vanish. We execute Operation Ghost. You move everything out, every scrap of your life. But you leave the shell. You leave the furniture. You make it look like you are still there, cooking dinner and sleeping in that bed. Let them feel safe. Let them think their retirement plan is secure in your air vent." And then I asked. And then, Elias smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "We let them hang themselves." I returned to the apartment with a new purpose. I plugged the hard drive back in and began the long process of cloning every single byte of data. I would put the original back in the vent, just where my father left it, but I would keep the copy. They wanted to frame me for their crimes, but they had just handed me the weapon to end them. I secured a lease on a new apartment in the Arts District under the name of Aurora Holdings, the shell company Aunt Beatrice had left me. It was a fortress of glass and steel, with biometric security and, most importantly, absolutely no connection to the Vance empire. My parents could hire 1,000 private investigators, but they would be looking for Rowan Vance, not a dissolved corporate entity from the 90s. The extraction process had to be surgical. I could not simply call a moving van. The doorman at my current building was on my father's payroll and reported my comings and goings like a prison warden. I became a smuggler in my own life. Over 3 nights, I moved my most precious belongings out in black trash bags and innocuous laundry hampers. My jewelry was hidden inside boxes of cereal. My backup hard drives were wrapped in winter sweaters. To the cameras in the lobby, I was just a diligent resident taking out the recycling or dropping off dry cleaning. Once the personal items were safe, I executed the swap. I bought an external hard drive identical to the one my father had hidden. I filled it with gigabytes of useless data, classical music files, and high-resolution stock photos of landscapes. I took the financial ledgers from the vent and replaced them with stacks of old newspapers cut to the exact dimensions of the documents. Wearing my cotton gloves, I placed the decoys back into the ductwork, careful to smudge the dust exactly as it had been before. On Wednesday, I received a summons to a charity dinner. It was not a request. I arrived at the gala wearing the silk dress my mother approved of and the submissive smile my father required. "Rowan, you look tired," my mother said, looking me up and down with critical eyes. "I hope you are keeping the apartment tidy. We might need to stop by soon. I am just working hard." "Mother," I lied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The place is spotless." Later in the evening, I slipped away to the terrace for fresh air and found myself standing behind a heavy velvet curtain. My father was on the other side, speaking in low tones to a man I recognized as a shady logistics broker. "Everything is in place," Harrison murmured, the ice clinking in his glass. "We move the shipment from the safe house next Friday. Once it is gone, we wash our hands of the liability." My blood ran cold. The safe house was my apartment. The liability was me. Friday was the deadline. I did not go home to sleep. I went into overdrive. I hired a specialized eviction cleanout crew, the kind that usually dealt with hoarding situations, and paid them triple to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. They arrived at 10 in the morning while I was ostensibly at work. They worked with terrifying efficiency. In 2 hours, my personal furniture, my clothes, my books, everything that made the space a home was gone. The apartment was stripped bare, leaving only the generic high-end furniture that belonged to the building management. It looked like a hotel room waiting for a guest, sterile and cold. Above, in the dark throat of the ventilation system, the decoy sat waiting. I spent the final hour upgrading the surveillance. I replaced the pinhead camera with a state-of-the-art wide-angle lens hidden inside a smoke detector. It was connected to a separate power source and broadcasted 4K video and high-fidelity audio directly to a secure cloud server. I checked the feed on my phone. The picture was crisp enough to read the label on a wine bottle. Finally, I stood at the granite kitchen island. The silence in the apartment was heavy. I placed my set of keys in the center of the counter. Beside them, I placed a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, folded once. I did not write a long manifesto. They did not deserve an explanation. Goodbye, I whispered to the empty room. I walked out and locked the door behind me. The trap was set. The first night in my new apartment felt like breathing pure oxygen after years of suffocating in a vault. The space was alien, filled with the smell of fresh paint and unboxed cardboard, but it was mine. However, the phantom weight of Friday hung over me. I could not truly rest until the trap was sprung. I knew the local police were compromised, mere puppets on my father's payroll, so I reached out to a contact from my university days. Sarah was now a senior analyst with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. I sent her the initial data packet anonymously, enough to whet their appetite, and promised the location of the physical evidence would be revealed within 48 hours. On Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Sylvia. I let it ring twice before answering, forcing my breathing to slow down. "Hello." "Mother," I said, pitching my voice to sound airy and distracted. "Rowan, darling, I was just thinking about you," she said, though her tone was sharp, probing. "Are you at the apartment I thought I might drop by with those fabric swatches we discussed?" "Oh, I am so sorry, Mother, but I am actually not there." I lied, gripping the edge of my new kitchen counter. I decided to take a spontaneous trip to that wellness spa in the valley. I really needed a detox. I'll be turning my phone off for 3 days to fully recharge. There was a pause, and then a sound that chilled my blood. It was a sigh of relief. "That sounds wonderful, dear," Sylvia said, her voice brightening instantly. "You deserve it. Don't worry about a thing. Just relax. We will speak on Monday." She hung up. She was happy I was gone. She was not happy for me. She was happy because the path was now clear for them to destroy me. I spent Friday morning with Elias in his office, signing a mountain of affidavits. We established a paper trail proving that I had vacated the penthouse days ago and had no knowledge of the items currently stored there. "This is the kill switch," Elias said, sliding a final document across the mahogany desk. "Once they enter, the silent alarm I installed triggers a direct priority alert to the FBI field office. The Bureau already has the warrant based on your tip. They just need the suspects on site." Friday night arrived, dragging a shroud of darkness over the city. I sat in my new living room in front of a 32-inch monitor. Elias sat beside me on a folding chair, nursing a cup of black coffee. The digital clock on the screen read 11 o'clock at night. My hands were cold. The feed from the penthouse was dark and silent, showing the grain of the empty hallway. "They might not come," I whispered, the doubt gnawing at me. "They will come," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the screen. Greed does not sleep. "Rowan." 10 minutes later, the motion sensor notification blinked red. 2 figures emerged from the service elevator. I leaned in, squinting. It was them, but they looked like caricatures of themselves. Harrison and Sylvia Vance, usually draped in Italian wool and silk, were dressed entirely in black. My father wore a black turtleneck and gloves, while my mother wore a dark trench coat and a beanie that covered her immaculate blonde hair. They looked like professional burglars, or at least what rich people imagined burglars looked like. They approached my door. I held my breath, waiting to see if they would use the spare key they claimed to have. They did not. My father pulled a small, rectangular electronic device from his pocket. He attached it to the panel of the smart lock. "That is a decoder," Elias noted, his voice devoid of emotion. "Possession of burglary tools. Unlawful entry. They just crossed the point of no return. On the screen, the lights on the lock cycled rapidly. A soft click echoed through the audio feed. My parents pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness of the apartment they thought was my home, unaware that they were walking straight into the mouth of a lion. The feed on my monitor was crystal clear. The moment the door swung open, the silence of the apartment was broken by the sharp click of my mother's heels on the hardwood. They stepped inside, and almost immediately, they froze. The wide-angle lens captured the sheer disorientation on their faces. The living room, usually cluttered with my books and easels, was a barren wasteland of empty space. Sylvia pulled off her mask, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. She ran to the nearest built-in cabinet and yanked it open. It was empty. She slammed it shut and moved to the next one. "Where is it? Where did she take everything?" Sylvia hissed, her voice rising an octave. "It looks like she moved out months ago. Harrison, tell me we didn't miss the window." My father grabbed her arm, his grip rough enough to bruise. "Stop it. Sylvia, forget her cheap furniture. Who cares if she took her paintings? We are here for the vent. The package is the only thing that matters. Get the chair." I watched as Harrison dragged one of the heavy bar stools from the kitchen island into the center of the room. He climbed up with a grunt of exertion that the high-fidelity microphone picked up clearly. He reached up and removed the vent cover. His hand disappeared into the darkness of the ceiling, and a moment later, he pulled out the black nylon bag. "Got it." He breathed out, clutching the bag to his chest. Check it now," Harrison Sylvia demanded, wringing her gloved hands. He stepped down and placed the bag on the floor. He unzipped it with frantic movements. He reached inside, expecting to feel the cool metal of the hard drive and the crisp paper of the ledgers. Instead, his hand came out clutching a handful of crumpled newspapers. He froze. He dug deeper, pulling out a cheap plastic USB drive. He plugged it into the tablet he had brought with him. "Music," he roared, throwing the tablet across the room. It is just Mozart. It is garbage." Sylvia let out a scream that distorted the audio feed for a split second. Her face, usually a mask of Botoxed calm, twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. The little brat. She knows that ungrateful little. "She stole our insurance," Sylvia shrieked. She kicked the empty bag across the room. "After everything we did, we gave her this apartment just so we could have a safe place to wash the money. And this is how she repays us, by stealing the leverage we needed for the auditors. She is dead to me." Harrison spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He paced the room, kicking at the wall. The plan was perfect. We blame the accounts on her. She takes the fall for the laundering, and we walk away clean. She was supposed to be the sacrificial lamb. How dare she? How dare she outsmart me? I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. They had just confessed to everything: money laundering, conspiracy, framing their own daughter, and it was all recorded in high-definition stereo sound. Harrison stopped pacing. His eyes locked onto the kitchen island. In the emptiness of the room, the small piece of cream-colored stationery I had left behind stood out like a beacon. He walked over to it slowly, his breathing heavy and ragged. He picked up the note. I saw his eyes scan the single sentence I had written. The color drained from his face instantly, leaving him looking old and defeated. "What? What does it say?" Sylvia demanded, rushing to his side. Harrison read it aloud, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. It says, "Mom, Dad, were you looking for this? I sent the originals to people who really care." He dropped the paper as if it were burning his fingers. He looked up, staring directly into the hidden camera lens without even knowing it was there. And for the first time in my life, I saw true terror in his eyes. The piece of paper had barely touched the floor when the air was shattered by the wail of sirens. It started as a distant whine, but swelled instantly into a deafening chorus that seemed to shake the very glass of the balcony doors. Blue and red lights washed over the living room, painting my parents' terrified faces in strobe-like flashes of panic. I had pressed the silent alarm button on my laptop keyboard the second my father's gloved hands had touched the decoy bag. I wanted them holding the bag when the cavalry arrived. Sylvia scrambled to the floor-to-ceiling window, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She pulled back the sheer curtain and peered down into the street. She recoiled as if she had been burned. Harrison! Look down there! She screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. My God, Harrison! It's not just the police. There are black vans everywhere. They have the whole building surrounded. My father stood frozen for a split second, his eyes darting from the note on the floor to the chaos outside. The realization hit him like a physical blow. It's a setup, he snarled, grabbing Sylvia by the arm so hard she yelped. That little traitor set us up. We have to go now. If we make it to the service elevator, we might have a chance, but the bag. Sylvia stammered, clutching the worthless nylon sack filled with newspapers to her chest. Leave it! Move! Harrison roared. He dragged her toward the front door. I watched on my monitor, my pulse hammering in my ears. This was the moment. They reached the door, and Harrison disengaged the lock with trembling fingers. He threw the door open, ready to sprint down the hallway. He never took a single step. The hallway was not empty. It was a wall of tactical gear. Half a dozen armored agents stood there, weapons raised and leveled directly at my parents' chests. FBI freeze hands where we can see them. A voice boomed, authoritative and leaving no room for negotiation. The scene descended into absolute chaos. Sylvia let out a shriek that pierced through my computer speakers. Instinctively, she tried to throw the black bag behind her, as if getting rid of it would erase the last 10 minutes. An agent moved with lightning speed, grabbing her wrist and twisting it behind her back. "Get off me! You are hurting me!" she wailed, thrashing uselessly. I am Sylvia Vance. You cannot touch me." Harrison was even less cooperative. His arrogance was a reflex he could not suppress. He tried to shove the lead agent aside. "Do you know who I am?" Harrison shouted, his face purple with rage. "I will have your badge for this. I will sue the entire—" He was cut off as two agents tackled him. I heard the sickening thud of his body hitting the hardwood floor, followed by the heavy rasp of zip ties being cinched tight. My father, the man who had terrified me for 3 decades, was now pressed cheek first against the floorboards, helpless. I watched it all, my hands gripping the edge of my desk. I expected to feel fear, or perhaps guilt. Instead, I felt a rush of adrenaline so pure it made me dizzy. It was the intoxicating sensation of chains breaking. One of the agents, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stepped over my father's prone form and began to read from a laminated card. "Harrison Vance, Sylvia Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, money laundering, and first-degree burglary," he recited, his voice cutting through their protests. Burglary. Harrison spat, straining against the restraints, his voice muffled by the floor. "This is my daughter's apartment. We have a right to be here. She let us in. This is a misunderstanding. We demand our lawyer." Sylvia sobbed, her makeup running in streaks down her face. "Call Elias Thorne. He will explain everything. This is our family property." The lead agent, whom I recognized as the special agent in charge, signaled for his team to haul my parents to their feet. He stepped close to Harrison, looking him dead in the eye. "There is no misunderstanding. Mr. Vance," the agent said, his tone icy. "The leaseholder, Ms. Rowan Vance, filed a formal complaint 3 days ago. She has provided us with sworn affidavits stating you had no permission to enter. Furthermore, she just transmitted a live video feed of your break-in and your confession regarding the evidence tampering." My parents went silent. Harrison looked up at the smoke detector where the camera was hidden. His eyes were wide, hollow pits of shock. He finally realized that the game was not just lost, it was over. "Rowan," he whispered, the name leaving his lips like a curse. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the federal building with a blinding intensity, matching the clarity I felt inside. I walked through the revolving doors at 9 o'clock, flanked by Elias. I had traded my usual sensible knitwear for a tailored white suit that cost more than my first car. It was armor. It was a statement. I was not the victim coming to beg for help. I was the executioner coming to sign the death warrant. We were escorted to a secure observation room, through the one-way glass. I saw a sight that would have once terrified me, but now only elicited a dull sense of pity. Harrison and Sylvia were in separate interrogation rooms, but the audio feed allowed us to hear the carnage. The united front of the Vance dynasty had crumbled faster than a sand castle in a hurricane. She knew Harrison was shouting, slamming his hand on the metal table. "My wife! She orchestrated the whole charity scheme I just signed the checks. I am a victim of her greed in the adjacent room." Sylvia was sobbing into her hands, her mascara smeared across her cheeks like war paint. "He forced me. He threatened to cut me off if I didn't help him hide the money. I am just a mother. I was trying to protect my family." I turned away from the glass, a cold smile touching my lips. "They are eating each other alive. Rats always do when the ship sinks," Elias murmured, adjusting his glasses. I placed a heavy briefcase on the table in front of Special Agent Miller. Inside was the original hard drive I had retrieved from the vent days ago, along with the dusty accordion folder from Aunt Beatrice's storage unit. "This is everything," I said, my voice steady. "The original ledgers, the bribery index, and 20 years of documented tax fraud my aunt collected. It connects the money in the vent directly to the offshore accounts." Agent Miller opened the file, his eyebrows raising as he scanned the documents. "This is comprehensive, but honestly, Ms. Vance, they dug their own graves last night. Look at this." He turned his laptop around to show us footage from the body camera of one of the arresting officers. It showed Harrison, pinned to the floor of my apartment, frantically shouting at an agent. "I will give you $50,000 right now." Harrison's voice on the recording was desperate. "Just let us walk out. 100,000 cash." "Do you hear me? I can make you rich attempted bribery of a federal officer," Miller said, closing the laptop. "That alone carries a hefty sentence. Add in the laundering and the burglary, and they are never seeing a country club again." As we left the office, officers were escorting my parents down the main corridor for processing. They looked small. Harrison was slumped over, defeated, but Sylvia saw me. She stopped, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and venom. "Rowan," she screamed, lunging forward before the officer restrained her. You ungrateful little wretch! How could you? I gave you life. I raised you to be elite. Is this how you repay us?" I stopped. The hallway went silent. I turned slowly to face the woman who had criticized my weight, my career, and my choices for 30 years. I looked her dead in the eye. "You didn't raise me, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "You raised a pawn. You raised an insurance policy. And, well, the game is over." I turned my back on her screaming protests and walked away. Near the exit, I saw the Vance family attorney, a man named Blackwood who usually looked like he owned the world. He was staring at a tablet, shaking his head. He looked up at Elias and simply shrugged, signaling that he knew the case was unwinnable. By the time we reached the lobby, the televisions mounted on the wall were already broadcasting breaking news. The headline scrolled in bold red letters. "Vance Real Estate Empire Crumbles, CEO and Wife Arrested in Daughter's Penthouse." "Look at the ticker," Elias pointed out. I watched as the stock symbol for Vance Corporation plummeted. It was a red line diving straight down, shedding millions of dollars in value every second. Partners were pulling out. The board was calling emergency meetings. The empire built on lies, and my Aunt Beatrice's silence was turning to dust before noon. I stepped out into the fresh air, took a deep breath, and finally, for the first time in my life, I did not feel the weight of the name Vance. I just felt free. The dominoes did not just fall, they were smashed with a sledgehammer. Within 24 hours of the arrest, federal agents swarmed the main Vance estate in the Hamptons and the corporate headquarters downtown. They hauled out box after box of evidence that mirrored exactly what I had provided from the hard drive. It was a perfect match. The forensic accountants found the accounts my father thought were so clever. It turned out he had been opening offshore holdings in the names of deceased employees to evade taxes. It was morbid, lazy, and indisputably illegal. The public reaction was visceral. When the news broke that the Vance Global Relief Fund, which claimed to build schools in developing nations, was actually funding my mother's collection of vintage designer handbags, the socialites who once drank their champagne turned on them. The Vance name, once a golden ticket in this city, became toxic radioactive waste. I was called to testify at the preliminary hearing. My parents' defense team tried the only strategy they had left: character assassination. They painted me as unstable, a bitter daughter with a history of mental health issues who had fabricated the evidence. She is hallucinating, their lawyer argued, sweating under the glare of the courtroom lights. She concocted this entire fantasy because she was off her medication. She is a danger to herself. I sat in the witness stand, spine straight, hands folded. I did not raise my voice. I answered every question with the precision of a surgeon. I have never been prescribed psychotropic medication, I stated calmly into the microphone, looking directly at the judge. However, I have preserved the emails where my father asked me to sign blank tax forms under duress. Would you like to see those desperate? Harrison tried one last dirty trick from his holding cell. He leaked a story to a tabloid claiming I was a heroin addict and that he had only broken into my apartment to stage an intervention. It was a vicious lie designed to discredit my testimony and paint him as a concerned father. But I had anticipated this. In the high-stakes world of art appraisal, where I handled paintings worth tens of millions of dollars, insurance companies required rigorous random drug testing. I had a clean record going back 5 years. I released the medical reports publicly before the tabloid ink was even dry. The accusation evaporated, leaving my father looking even more desperate and malicious. He is lying, Harrison shouted during the bail hearing, his composure finally shattering completely as his plan backfired. She is the one who is sick. You have to believe me. The judge, a stern woman with zero patience for white-collar theatrics, looked down over her glasses. Mr. Vance, given your access to offshore funds and your demonstrated willingness to tamper with evidence, I am denying bail. She ruled, banging the gavel with a sound that signaled the end of their era. You and your wife will remain in federal custody until trial. With the heads of the snake caged, the body withered, the banks froze their personal assets. The mortgages were called in. The creditors began circling like sharks. This triggered a specific clause in Aunt Beatrice's trust, which I had only recently discovered. It stated that in the event of the Vance Company's insolvency, her separate trust, which had been accumulating interest for decades, would become liquid for the purpose of family asset preservation. I used that money, clean money, to buy the one thing my parents actually cared about: their private art collection. The banks were auctioning it off for pennies on the dollar to cover debts. I bought back the Monets and the sculptures, not to give them back, but to ensure they were owned by someone who actually appreciated them, not just their price tags. The final step was the most personal. I walked into the city clerk's office on a rainy Tuesday. I filed the paperwork to legally drop the name Vance. It was a stain I could finally wash off. I chose my maternal grandmother's maiden name, a strong, simple name that owed nothing to anyone. Sign here, please, the clerk said. I signed the document with a flourish. Rowan Sterling. I said aloud, tasting the sound of it. It sounds clean. I walked out into the rain, leaving the daughter of the disgraced billionaire behind. I was no longer a Vance. I was my own woman, and for the first time, my legacy was entirely my own to write. The trial was less of a legal battle and more of a public autopsy of the Vance family legacy. With the high-definition video of the break-in, the confession caught on audio, and the mountain of financial documents I had provided, the defense attorney looked like a man trying to stop a tsunami with a paper umbrella. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The judge, clearly disgusted by the abuse of power and parental trust, handed down the maximum sentence recommended by the prosecution, 15 years in federal prison for each of them. The next morning, the image was plastered on every newsstand in the city. Harrison and Sylvia Vance, the couple who once sneered at anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing, were shuffled out of the courthouse in bright orange jumpsuits. They looked gray, shrunken, and utterly defeated. My mother's hair, deprived of her weekly coloring appointments, was showing roots of steel gray, and my father looked like a confused old man without his expensive suit to hold him upright. I did not attend the sentencing. I saw no reason to be in the same room with them ever again. Instead, I sat on my plush velvet sofa in my new apartment, watching the events unfold on the news. In my hand was a crystal glass filled with a 1996 vintage Bordeaux. It was a bottle my father had hidden in his secret cellar, claiming it was too good for common palates. It tasted like victory. Cheers. Dad. I toasted the screen as the bailiff led him away in handcuffs. It has notes of karma. With the legal chapter closed, I turned my attention to the physical remnants of my past. The penthouse, the scene of their crime and my liberation, was now a notorious property. Instead of letting it sit, I capitalized on the infamy. I listed it for sale and sparked a bidding war. It was eventually purchased for $4,500,000 by a tech billionaire who had a fascination with true crime stories. He loved the idea of living in the Vance trap. I took that money, combined with the funds returned to me by the court from the seized assets, and did the one thing my parents never would have done. I started a legitimate charity. The Beatrice Sterling Foundation for the Arts was born. It was not a tax shelter. It was a real organization dedicated to funding grants for underprivileged artists. I was building a legacy that would actually last, using the very fortune my parents had tried to hoard. A month later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The envelope was made of rough, cheap paper and stamped with the seal of the Federal Correctional Facility. It was from Sylvia. I stood over my shredder, debating whether to open it. Curiosity won out. I sliced it open. Rowan, please. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The food here is inedible. I need money for the commissary. I need face cream. My skin is drying out. Please, darling, don't be cruel. We are still family. I stared at the words, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a profound sense of detachment. She was still worried about face cream while serving 15 years for racketeering. I did not send money. I did not write a letter. Instead, I took a postcard I had printed for the real estate listing, a glossy photo of the penthouse living room, completely empty, stripped bare of everything they had tried to steal. On the back, I wrote 5 words. There is nothing here. I mailed it and never looked back. My career skyrocketed. I was no longer just an appraiser. I was the Iron Lady of the art world, the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt empire. The same socialites who had once looked down on me as the disappointing daughter now swarmed around me at gallery openings, desperate for my attention. Rowan, darling Mrs. Vanderwall cooed at a gala, clutching my arm with a claw-like hand. We always knew your parents were, well, difficult. We are so proud of you. We should do lunch. I gently removed her hand from my sleeve, dusting off the fabric as if she had left a smudge. I don't think so. Patricia, I said, my voice cool and even. My lunch schedule is full. Indefinitely. I walked away, leaving her sputtering in her sequins. I went home to my quiet, secure apartment. I locked the door, not out of fear, but out of habit. For the first time in 30 years, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt safe. There were no cameras watching me, no parents plotting against me, and no secrets hidden in the vents. I was finally, truly, alone. And it was wonderful. I drove to the storage facility one last time under the cover of a gray, drizzling afternoon. The legal war was over, but Aunt Beatrice had left instructions for one final task. She had told me about a small steel box tucked away in the deepest corner of her unit, a box she said I should only open when the Vance empire had turned to dust. Now that my parents were wearing state-issued jumpsuits and their assets were being liquidated, the time had come. The unit smelled of old paper and memories. I found the box exactly where she said it would be, hidden behind a stack of vintage hat boxes. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and locked with a combination Beatrice had made me memorize years ago. My fingers turned the dial. 3, 1, 9. The latch clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the silence. Inside, there were no jewels or cash. There was only a sheaf of yellowed documents and a birth certificate that looked incredibly fragile. I picked them up, my hands trembling slightly. I read the birth certificate first. It belonged to Harrison Vance, but the names listed under parents were not my grandparents. They were two strangers I had never heard of. My father was adopted. I dug deeper and found the true bombshell, my great-grandfather's original, unaltered will. It stated clearly, in elegant cursive script, that the entirety of the family fortune, the land, the trust, and the name, was to pass solely to his blood descendants. It explicitly excluded any adopted children from inheriting the primary estate, offering them only a modest stipend. Harrison had known. He had hidden this will, buried his own adoption records, and usurped a legacy that was never his to claim. I leaned back against the dusty wall, a breathless laugh escaping my lips. For my entire life, Harrison had treated me like an interloper, a burden he had to tolerate in his kingdom. He had made me feel like I had to earn my place at the table. But the truth was the opposite. He was the squatter. He was the fraud. I was the blood heir. The millions I had seized, the art I had bought back, the company I had dismantled, none of it was theft. It was a restoration of the natural order. I was not taking revenge. I was taking back what had belonged to me since the day I was born. I held the lighter in my hand, watching the flame dance. I could release this to the press. I could humiliate him further, destroying the last shred of his identity. But as I looked at the crumbling paper, I realized I did not need to. The world already saw him as a criminal. This truth was for me. It was the final key to unlocking the cage in my mind. I put the papers back in the box and locked it. I would keep his secret, not for his sake, but because I did not need the drama. Knowing I was the rightful queen of this board was enough. I returned to my apartment as the sun began to set, painting the city skyline in hues of violet and gold. I stepped out onto my balcony, the wind whipping through my hair. I looked down at the streets below, feeling a profound sense of weightlessness. I was no longer the victim of a narcissist, nor was I the vengeful daughter. I was simply Rowan. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Elias. It is done. The appeals have been denied. They are being transferred to maximum security tomorrow. You are free. I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Harrison and Sylvia would grow old within gray concrete walls. They would wither away, forgotten by the society they worshipped, their names becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale told at cocktail parties. Their legacy was shame. Mine was just beginning. I turned off my phone and slipped it into my pocket. A smile, genuine and unburdened, spread across my face. I turned away from the city lights and stepped back into the warmth of my living room. I closed the heavy glass door and turned the deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a chapter ending and a book closing. No one would ever cross this threshold without my permission again. I was safe. I was wealthy. And for the first time in 30 years, I was completely, irrevocably free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment below where you are listening from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts on Rowan's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.